Researchers studied people with green eyes. They weren't ready for the results. Out of every 100 people you pass on the street today, only about 2 will have green eyes. That single fact makes green the rarest eye color on the planet. Rarer than red hair, rarer than being born left-handed. But when scientists finally sat down and mapped the genetics behind it in detail, what they uncovered wasn't just a rarity statistic. It was a discovery that quietly overturned almost everything most of us were taught about how eye color works. And it revealed that the color itself isn't even real in the way we assume it is. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your biology teacher was wrong, why there isn't a single molecule of green pigment inside anyone's eyes, and why the story of green eyes turns out to be a story about ancient migration, written directly into the human face. For most of the 20th century, the explanation handed to students was simple almost to the point of being charming. Eye color, they were told, worked like a basic inheritance chart. Brown was dominant, blue was recessive, green sat somewhere in between, and you could predict a child's eyes with a simple grid, the same kind used to teach pea plant genetics in introductory biology. It felt satisfying because it was clean and it was easy to teach in a single class period. The problem is that it never actually matched what showed up in real families. 2 brown-eyed parents having a blue-eyed child should have been almost impossible under that model, yet it happened constantly in ordinary households all over the world. Full siblings, raised by the same 2 parents and carrying overlapping sets of genes, would sometimes end up with wildly different eye colors from one another. One child with deep brown, another with gray, another with a green that didn't match anyone else at the table. For decades, these cases were treated as oddities, brushed aside as exceptions that didn't need to shake the underlying theory. But exceptions that keep piling up eventually stop being exceptions. And once large-scale genetic sequencing became possible, researchers finally had the tools to test the old model directly against real DNA from thousands of people. The result was not a minor correction. It was a full collapse of the classroom version of the story. Eye color, it turned out, isn't controlled by 1 gene or even 2. Genome-wide studies have identified more than a dozen genes that each play some role in shaping the final color of a human iris. Scientists call this kind of trait polygenic, built not from a single instruction, but from many genes acting together, each nudging the outcome slightly in one direction or another. Height works the same way. So does skin tone. There is no single eye color gene waiting to be found because eye color was never that kind of trait to begin with. This is where green becomes genuinely unusual. Brown and blue can each arise from a fairly wide range of genetic combinations, which is part of why they're so common. Green is different. It depends on a narrow, specific alignment of multiple genetic factors at once, which is a large part of why it shows up so rarely across the human population. Rather than picture a coin flip, it's more accurate to picture a control panel with more than a dozen dials, each one turned to a slightly different setting in every person on Earth. Crank certain dials one way and you get the deepest brown. Set them differently and you drift toward hazel or gray or the palest blue. Green requires several of those dials to land in a fairly tight, specific range simultaneously, which is exactly why it's the rarest outcome on the whole spectrum. To understand how that panel actually works, it helps to start with the single most influential gene involved, a gene called OCA2, found on chromosome 15. OCA2 carries the blueprint for a protein that governs how much melanin gets deposited into the front layers of the iris. Melanin is the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and hair, and inside the eye it works the same way it does everywhere else in the body. It absorbs light. The more melanin present, the darker the iris appears, sometimes so dark it looks almost black in dim lighting. Less melanin allows more light to pass through and scatter, which opens the door to lighter shades. In that sense, OCA2 functions like a volume knob for pigment, setting the baseline for how dark or light an eye is capable of becoming. But OCA2 doesn't operate alone, and it doesn't set its own level. Sitting immediately next to it on the same chromosome is a second gene called HERK2. HERK2 doesn't produce pigment itself. Instead, it regulates how active OCA2 is allowed to be, functioning more like a dimmer switch than a light source. Researchers eventually traced this regulatory effect down to an astonishingly small detail. A single position within HERC2, a spot geneticists label RS12913832, where the genetic code can read as one of two possible letters. That one-letter difference, sitting in a stretch of DNA that doesn't even build a protein, correlates so strongly with pigment levels that it can predict with striking accuracy whether someone is likely to have brown eyes or lighter eyes. Out of the roughly 3 billion letters that make up the human genome, this single position carries an outsized influence over one of the most visible traits a person has. Even that switch isn't the end of the story, because variation elsewhere in OCA2 itself can adjust how strongly the HERC2 signal actually gets expressed, a phenomenon geneticists describe using the term penetrance, meaning how fully a genetic instruction shows up in the final result. Two people can carry an identical version of that HERC2 switch and still end up with noticeably different eye colors, because other nearby genetic variation is quietly turning the effect up or down. This layered interaction, one gene producing pigment, a second gene regulating how much pigment gets made, and additional variants fine-tuning the whole system, explains most of the difference between brown eyes and blue eyes. But it does not, on its own, explain green. And this is exactly where the science gets genuinely strange, because green eyes require an entirely different kind of explanation, one that has almost nothing to do with pigment at all. Here is the detail that surprises nearly everyone the first time they hear it. There is no green pigment anywhere inside a human eye. None. Unlike a green leaf, which contains chlorophyll, or a red apple, which contains anthocyanin pigments, a green iris does not contain any molecule that is actually green in color. What you're seeing when you look at green eyes is not a substance. It's an optical effect produced by the physical structure of the eye itself. To understand how that works, picture the layered structure of the iris. Its front layer, the part you actually see when you look someone in the eye, is called the stroma. The stroma isn't a solid sheet of color. It's a loose, semi-transparent mesh made of collagen fibers, threaded through with a small amount of pale yellowish pigment called lipochrome. On its own, that thin mesh has very little color to offer. What gives it color is what happens when light passes through it and bounces back out. When light strikes the fine collagen fibers of the stroma, shorter wavelengths, the blues, scatter more easily than longer wavelengths like red and orange. More blue light reflects back toward the viewer than any other wavelength. This process is called Rayleigh scattering, and it is the exact same physical principle that makes the daytime sky look blue. Not because the sky contains blue pigment, but because sunlight scatters off molecules in the atmosphere in a way that favors shorter blue wavelengths. A blue human eye works on the same principle. It isn't a blue pigmented eye at all. It's a nearly colorless stroma with very little melanin behind it, scattering light in a way our brains interpret as blue. Now bring the yellow lipochrome pigment back into the picture. Layer that pale yellow tint over the structural blue produced by scattering, and the two combine visually the same way blue and yellow paint combine on a palette. They blend into green. That is the real mechanism behind green eyes. Blue light generated by physical scattering off collagen fibers, filtered through a light wash of yellow pigment. Adjust the amount of melanin and lipochrome even slightly, and the same I can drift toward hazel, amber, gray, or blue. This also explains something hazel-eyed people have insisted on for years, often to skeptical friends, that their eye color genuinely seems to shift depending on lighting and surroundings. That's not imagination. It's the same scattering effect interacting with uneven melanin distribution across the iris, which is why hazel and green eyes in particular can look noticeably different in sunlight, indoor light, or overcast weather. Given how specific and delicate this whole system is, it's reasonable to assume green eyes must be an ancient trait, something that has existed in human populations for tens of thousands of years. Ancient DNA tells a different story, and it's one of the more unexpected findings to come out of recent paleogenetics. When researchers sequenced the genomes of early Europeans, they found that most of these populations had dark hair, dark eyes, and notably darker skin than modern Europeans, and that this combination persisted until surprisingly recently, only a few thousand years ago in evolutionary terms. Light-colored eyes, as a widespread trait, appear to be a relatively late development in human history. Genetic evidence points toward the variant responsible for green and other light-colored eyes originating somewhere in the region near the Caucasus Mountains and the western Eurasian steppe, with some of the earliest confirmed traces showing up in ancient remains from that broader area. From there, the trait appears to have spread outward along major migration routes, eventually becoming concentrated in populations across northern and western Europe through a combination of population movement and genetic drift. The random fluctuation in how common a gene variant becomes within a smaller, relatively isolated group over generations. This is part of why countries like Ireland and regions of Scandinavia report some of the highest rates of green eyes in the world today. Their prevalence there isn't random. It's a genetic echo of migration patterns that occurred long before written history in those regions began. Globally, green remains the rarest naturally occurring eye color, generally estimated at around 2% of the population, compared to brown eyes making up the large majority of humanity and blue eyes accounting for a notable but smaller share. Yet green-eyed individuals appear in nearly every part of the world today, a visible reminder of centuries of migration, trade, and mixing between populations. It's also worth noting from a practical standpoint that because green and other light-colored irises contain less protective melanin than brown eyes, they carry a somewhat elevated sensitivity to ultraviolet light. One more reason UV-blocking sunglasses are worth taking seriously, regardless of what color your eyes happen to be. There's something worth sitting with in all of this. Green eyes aren't a fixed, stored color the way we usually think about color. Every shade you see is being generated in real time by light interacting with a living structure. There's no pigment sitting there like paint in a can, waiting to be revealed. The color exists only as an ongoing interaction between collagen fibers, a trace of yellow pigment, and whatever light happens to be present in that exact moment. Move someone from warm indoor lighting into overcast daylight, and their green eyes can visibly shift in tone because the physical conditions producing that color have changed, even though the underlying biology hasn't moved at all. This is also why photographs so often struggle to capture green eyes accurately, with people frequently noting that their eyes appear one color in one photo and a different color in the next. That's not a flaw in the camera. It's an honest reflection of how dependent this particular color is on lighting conditions. It also explains why full siblings can end up with such different eye colors despite sharing the same two parents. With more than a dozen genetic factors involved, and green requiring several of them to align within a narrow range, even small differences in which gene variants each child happens to inherit can push one sibling toward green, another toward gray, and another toward a warm hazel that seems to shift throughout the day. They aren't drawing from fundamentally different genetic material. They're drawing slightly different combinations from the same shared pool, and with this many variables in play, that's enough to produce visibly different outcomes at the same dinner table. There's one more layer to this story worth mentioning, because it reframes how we think about a trait like this. Since the genetic combination behind green eyes is both recent in evolutionary terms and comparatively rare, it hasn't had the kind of long time span that usually allows a trait to settle into a stable, predictable pattern across a population. In that sense, green eyes sit near the leading edge of ongoing human variation, not an ancient, settled inheritance, but a comparatively young genetic configuration that continues to spread and mix as populations move, intermarry, and blend across regions that were once far more genetically separated. So the simple inheritance chart most of us were taught in school wasn't just an oversimplification. It left out a far more interesting explanation than the one it offered. There's no single dominant gene deciding brown beats green beats blue. There's no green pigment sitting inside anyone's iris. Instead, there's a finely tuned interaction between more than a dozen genes, a regulatory switch built from a single letter of DNA, a mesh of collagen fibers scattering light the same way our atmosphere does, a faint wash of yellow pigment, and a genetic signature that traces back to migrations that happened only a few thousand years ago. Green eyes aren't simply a color. They're closer to a physical process, caught in the act of happening every single time someone looks into them. If you found this as surprising as I did researching it, let me know in the comments. Do you have green eyes yourself? Or do you know someone whose eyes seem to change color depending on the light or the day? I'd genuinely like to hear your experience with it, because stories like that are often what shape which topic I dig into next.